The story begins not at a crime scene, but in a cramped records room deep inside a police headquarters, years after the sirens have faded. A single cardboard box waits on a metal shelf, its lid warped from time and handling. On the side, in fading marker, someone has written a name and a case number that were once nightly headline material and then, without explanation, disappeared from the news. It took years of legal battles and freedom of information requests to pry that box open. When the files were finally unsealed, the first thing that stood out wasn't what they revealed, but what they hid. Thick black bars marching across every page, entire paragraphs swallowed by redaction. There were missing body camera logs that jumped from one timestamp to another with no explanation. An internal email chain showed senior officers arguing, not about how to solve the case, but about how to control the narrative. One commander warned that if certain details reached the press, public confidence in this department will be impossible to restore. Another replied simply, "Then we make sure they don't." Buried in the redactions were phrases that slipped through by mistake, little shards of truth that made no sense on their own. A detective's handwritten note about the underground room, a reference in a timeline to an estimated 11-day survival window, a bullet point, quickly corrected in a later draft, labeled "Missed Opportunity, Welfare Check Not Completed." Publicly, the message had always been simple. At every podium, under every bank of microphones, officials repeated the same lines. They were exhausting all leads. They were throwing every resource at the search. They were doing everything for the victim and her family. But these files, opened at last, tell a different story, one of hesitation, indifference, and a decision somewhere along the way that certain truths were better left buried with the evidence. For years, relatives and local reporters suspected there was more to the story than the polished statements suggested. Requests for records were denied, delayed, or returned with so much ink on the pages they were almost meaningless. The official line was that disclosure would compromise ongoing investigative interests, even after the case was formally closed. Only after a coalition of journalists, lawyers, and the victim's family went to court again and again did a judge finally order the department to release what it had been holding back. Now, under the harsh glow of a desk lamp, those long hidden pages spill across the table. There are shift logs out of sequence, phone calls that were never returned, and a supervisor who signed off on closing a welfare check after a patrol unit spent less than 2 minutes at a locked front door. There are maps with circles drawn around a single suburban house, notes about neighbors hearing faint sounds at night, and a chilling annotation in the margin of one report. Window of survivability estimated at 11 days from initial contact. Scattered among the paperwork are photographs that were never released to the public. In grainy black and white, investigators move through a neatly kept home that looks like any other on the street, until the camera angle shifts to a narrow door at the back of a walk-in closet. The next image shows a steep wooden staircase leading down into darkness. The caption, partly cut off by a copier, reads, "Sublevel storage area, non-permitted structure." A later evidence log refers to it more bluntly, "underground room." From the podium, the case was presented as a tragedy no one could have prevented, a mystery solved too late to save a life. Inside these files, another version of events slowly emerges, one in which someone was still alive behind that locked door, in that hidden room while officers drove away. This is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about a cover-up, about the deliberate erasure of failure, the polishing of reputations while evidence decomposed, and the institutional refusal to admit that a life could have been saved if anyone had cared enough to look. Before we can understand why the department fought so hard to bury this story, we need to meet the person they failed. We need to know who she was, what she dreamed about, and how a system designed to protect her became the very reason she died alone. To understand what those buried files really mean, we have to step back from the evidence table and return to the place where it all began, Maple Falls. It is the kind of town that realtors dream about selling and city councils love to advertise. Tree-lined streets wind past tidy homes. There are banners for the annual Harvest Festival on every light pole, and the town's website proudly calls it the safest place to raise a family. For years, Maple Falls has backed that slogan with numbers. Crime rates here are comfortably below the state average. The local paper runs more stories about bake sales and honor roll lists than arrests. Parents let kids ride their bikes to the park. Doors stay unlocked during summer barbecues, and everybody seems to know everybody else's name. At the center of this picture is a police department that looks, from the outside, exactly like you would hope. The station sits beside the town library, flags carefully lit at night, flower beds planted by a local scout troop. Officers attend school career days, sponsor youth soccer teams, and post smiling photos with residents at the farmers market. When the chief stands in front of a camera, he comes across as calm, competent, and reassuring, the kind of authority figure small towns are built to trust. But behind the glossy brochures and carefully crafted press conferences, Maple Falls has cracks it refuses to acknowledge. The town's social services office is squeezed into a converted storefront with flickering lights and a waiting list that grows longer every month. Caseworkers carry far more families than recommended, juggling reports of domestic disputes, truancy, and quiet neglect that never makes the news. Inside the police department, budget cuts have reduced training sessions and overtime for investigations, but not the marketing budget. There's always money for new community outreach posters, fewer resources for follow-up on calls that seem messy or complicated. The unspoken motto is simple: bad things happen other places. And when something unsettling does happen here, the first instinct is not to ask what went wrong, but to insist it doesn't reflect who they really are. Stories about teens in trouble are quietly framed as personal failures, not community responsibilities. When a young person disappears, the word that comes easiest is runaway. It is a label that closes doors before they even have a chance to open. This kind of environment, where image matters more than infrastructure, where discomfort is mistaken for impossibility, primes a system not to protect, but to dismiss. Especially when the people in trouble don't fit the mold of what Maple Falls likes to believe about itself. A single mother working night shifts to make rent. A teenager living above a hardware store instead of in a house with a yard. A family that needs help instead of offering it at a charity bake sale. In a town that prides itself on being safe, these are the people who quietly slip through the gap between the myth and the reality, the space where the flower beds end and the flickering lights of an underfunded office begin. Maple Falls needed to believe in its own story. It needed to believe that danger was something that happened elsewhere, imported by outsiders or bad choices, never grown in local soil. It needed to believe that its police department was as competent as it was photogenic, that its systems worked because its statistics said so. That need to preserve the image, to avoid the mess, to keep the narrative clean, would shape every decision made in the days to come. It would determine who got believed and who got dismissed. It would decide which calls were prioritized and which were filed away. And ultimately, it would cost a 14-year-old girl her life. Because in Maple Falls, admitting that something terrible could happen here, to one of their own, in broad daylight, right under their noses, that would mean admitting the whole story was a lie, and the town wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. 14-year-old Lena Brooks lived her life inside this contradiction in a town that promised protection while quietly distancing itself from kids it didn't understand. She was an honor roll student at Maple Falls Middle School, a wiry midfielder on the girls' soccer team, and a big sister who still made time to braid her younger brother's hair before picture day. Teachers remember her as the girl who always sat near the front, pencils sharpened, questions ready, a quiet determination in the way she approached every assignment. Her bedroom walls were lined with posters of her favorite players, but on the corkboard above her desk, she had pinned something different: printouts of crime scene diagrams and forensic articles she had found online. Lena told friends she wanted to be a forensic scientist, the kind of person who could look at what others ignored and still find the truth. At home, life was busy and imperfect, but full of love. Lena lived with her mother, Carla, a nurse who worked nights at the regional hospital, and her 8-year-old brother, Mason. Money was often tight, and the apartment they rented above a hardware store rattled when trucks rolled through downtown, but the small rituals mattered more. On school mornings, Lena packed Mason's lunch and walked him to the bus stop before heading to her own classes. In the evenings, before Carla left for another 12-hour shift, they would crowd together on the couch, sharing takeout and watching crime shows that Lena insisted were research. She would pause the TV to explain how investigators lifted fingerprints or analyzed blood spatter, her eyes bright with the kind of focus most kids her age reserved for social media or celebrity gossip. Carla would laugh and tell her she was going to solve crimes someday, maybe even cold cases that had stumped everyone else. Lena would grin and say, "I'm going to find things people miss." She kept a journal not for diary entries about crushes or drama, but for notes. Questions she had about forensic techniques. Lists of true crime documentaries she wanted to watch. A timeline she was building for a case she'd read about online, trying to piece together what the investigators had gotten wrong. She was analytical, methodical, curious in a way that made adults smile and say she was going places. Lena Brooks was exactly the kind of kid a community should be proud of. Responsible. Driven. A girl who took care of her little brother, kept her grades up without being asked, and had a plan for her future that went. Beyond vague dreams, she knew what she wanted and was already teaching herself how to get there. But in Maple Falls, there was a gap between who you were and how you were seen. And that gap had everything to do with where you lived, who your parents were, and whether your life looked like the version of normal the town preferred to acknowledge. Lena didn't live in one of the houses with the manicured lawns and 2-car garages. She lived above a hardware store. Her mother worked nights, which meant Lena sometimes put herself and her brother to bed. There was no father in the picture. He had left when Mason was a baby and never come back. Carla did everything she could, but she was one person working one job trying to raise 2 kids. And sometimes that meant things were held together with duct tape and determination. To people who wanted to see it, this looked like struggle, weakness, a home that wasn't quite stable enough. And when Lena disappeared, that perception would matter more than anything she had ever accomplished. Because the same system that praised her in parent-teacher conferences, that put her name on the honor roll and gave her a jersey with her number on the back, would take one look at her Jatin situation and decide she was a flight risk. The same officials who smiled for photos at school events would scan her life for reasons she might have left on her own, and they would find them. Not because they were there, but because they were looking. A single mother who worked nights. A teenage girl with responsibilities beyond her years. An apartment that wasn't quite middle class enough. These would become evidence, not of resilience, but of instability. Not of love, but of motive to run. Lena Brooks was the kind of kid Maple Falls should have been built to protect. Smart, determined, caring, with everything ahead of her and people who would have done anything to keep her safe. But she was also the kind of kid the system had already learned to overlook, because protecting her would have required looking past the surface, past the easy labels, past the discomfort of acknowledging that danger doesn't only come for families who fit the brochure. And Maple Falls had never been good at uncomfortable truths. In the end, Lena would become exactly what she had always wanted to be. Someone searching for the truth in what others missed. She just never imagined she would be searching for her own life. October 12th started like any other Tuesday. Lena woke up at 6:15 a.m., earlier than she needed to because Mason was a slow eater and she liked to make sure he had time for breakfast. She wore her favorite hoodie dark blue with the school soccer team logo over a gray t-shirt and jeans. Before she left, she sent her mother a text, the same one she sent most mornings when Carla was finishing a night shift at the hospital. Got Mason ready. Love you. See you tonight. Carla replied with a heart emoji and a reminder to grab the grocery money from the envelope in the kitchen drawer. They needed milk. Lena walked Mason to the bus stop at the corner, watched him climb on, and then headed in the opposite direction toward the middle school. Friends saw her in homeroom. She turned in a science report early. At lunch, she sat with the same group she always did, talking about an upcoming game and laughing at someone's terrible joke. In 6th period English, her teacher called on her to read aloud, and she did, clearly and without hesitation, the way she always did. After school, she stayed for a quick team meeting, nothing formal. Just the coach going over the practice schedule for the week. By 3:45 p.m., she was walking out the front doors of Maple Falls Middle School, backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds in. The route home was one she had walked hundreds of times. Down 7th Street, past the coffee shop and the flower store that always smelled like roses, even from the sidewalk. Left onto Birch Avenue where the old houses had porches with swings and American flags. It was broad daylight. There were cars in driveways, a woman raking leaves, a mail carrier making his rounds. Somewhere in those 4 blocks, Lena Brooks vanished. No one saw it happen. No one heard her scream. There were no skid marks, no witnesses who remembered a struggle. No surveillance cameras pointed at the right stretch of sidewalk at the right time. One moment she was walking home through a neighborhood where parents let their children play unsupervised, and the next, she was gone. She never made it to the grocery store. She never picked up Mason from his bus stop. Carla came home just after 8 a.m., the way she always did after a 12-hour shift, exhausted and ready to sleep for a few hours before the kids got home. The apartment was quiet. She assumed Lena had already left for school. Everything seemed normal. It wasn't until 4:30 p.m., when Carla woke up and went to start dinner, that she realized Mason was sitting alone in the living room, playing on a tablet, still in his jacket. "Where's your sister?" Mason shrugged. "She didn't come get me. I walked home by myself." Carla felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She called Lena's phone. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She texted, called the school, called Lena's friends. No one had seen her since she left the building. Her last known location, according to a friend who'd walked partway with her, was the corner of 7th and Birch, 2 blocks from home. Carla is a nurse. She has spent years learning to recognize when something is wrong, not just sick or delayed or inconvenient, but fundamentally, dangerously wrong. She knows the difference between anxiety and intuition, between worry and the cold, creeping certainty that something terrible has already happened. She called the police at 5:02 p.m. The officer who answered took her information with a tone that can only be described as calm, not reassuring calm. He asked the standard questions: age, height, what she was wearing, any history of running away, any conflicts at home, any reason she might not want to come home. Carla said, No, you don't understand. She wouldn't do this. She had her brother. She had responsibilities. Something is wrong. The officer said he understood, said they'd send someone out to take a report. Said that in cases like this, kids usually turn up within a few hours. Carla wanted to scream. She wanted to reach through the phone and grab him by the collar and make him feel what she was feeling, the visceral, undeniable wrongness of it. But she didn't. She gave him the address and waited. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone who knew Lena, the girl who wanted to solve crimes, who studied forensic science in her free time, who pinned timelines to her corkboard, and dreamed of finding the truth in what others overlooked. She had become the mystery. And while her mother sat by the window watching for headlights, watching for any sign of her daughter coming home, Lena was closer than anyone imagined. 11 minutes away by car, 6 minutes from the police station. Still alive, still breathing, still reachable. The window was already closing. When Officer Derek Portman arrived at Carla's apartment at 6:47 p.m., he carried a clipboard with a standard missing persons intake form. It was a 2-page document, printed on pale blue paper, with sections for physical description, last known location, clothing, and a series of yes or no questions designed to assess risk level. Near the bottom of page 1, there was a row of checkboxes under the heading Probable Category. The options were abduction, family, abduction, non-family, lost, injured, endangered, and runaway. Officer Portman sat at Carla's kitchen table for less than 20 minutes. He asked about Lena's friends, her habits, her mood lately. He asked if there had been any arguments at home, any changes in behavior, any signs she was unhappy. Carla, desperate to be helpful, desperate to give him anything that might bring her daughter home faster, told him the truth. Lena was a good kid, responsible. But yes, they'd had a small argument 2 days earlier about curfew. Lena had wanted to stay out later with friends on the weekend, and Carla had said no. It wasn't a fight, it was a conversation, the kind every parent has with a teenager testing boundaries. Portman wrote it down. He asked about school. Carla said Lena was on the honor roll. Portman asked if there had been any recent problems. Carla hesitated, then mentioned that Lena had been stressed about a quiz she'd gotten a B- and was annoyed with herself because she'd been aiming for an A. Portman wrote that down too. He asked about Carla's work schedule. She explained that she worked nights, that Lena watched Mason in the evenings, that it was temporary until she could switch to day shifts. She said it like an apology, as if she already knew how it would sound. Portman nodded, his pen moving across the page. When he left, he had checked the box marked runaway. That single checkmark changed everything. In the logic of the Maple Falls Police Department, a runaway case was not an emergency, it was a waiting game. The protocols were clear. File the report, enter the information into the database, notify nearby jurisdictions, and monitor. No Amber Alert, no immediate search parties, no all-hands mobilization. The reasoning, as it was explained in training materials later obtained through public records requests, was that the vast majority of runaway cases resolve themselves within 48 to 72 hours. Teenagers leave after arguments, cool off, and come home. Deploying significant resources for every missing teen would overwhelm the department and waste time that could be spent on higher priority cases. But the criteria for what made someone a runaway were subjective, shaped as much by bias as by evidence. In the report Portman filed that night, he listed the following as indicators that Lena had left voluntarily. Recent argument with mother regarding curfew. Academic stress, B- grade, described as perfectionistic tendencies. Mother works night shifts. Subject has caretaking responsibilities for younger sibling. No signs of forced entry at residence. Subject's belongings, backpack, phone, missing, suggesting she took them with her. To anyone reading it coldly, it might have seemed reasonable. But every single one of those points was normal. Teenagers argue about curfew. High-achieving students stress over grades. Older siblings in single-parent homes help out. Carla tried to explain this. She told Portman, and later his supervisor, and later the detective assigned to the case, that Lena would never leave Mason. She told them her daughter had plans, goals, a future she was actively working toward. She told them Lena's phone was off, which was unheard of. Lena was glued to that phone. The response, repeated in different words by different officers, was always some version of the same thing. We understand you're worried. But in our experience, they almost always come home. Teenagers don't tell their parents when they need space. Carla wanted to scream that Lena wasn't like that. That she knew her daughter, but she could see in their faces that they had already made up their minds. What Carla didn't know, what wouldn't become clear until years later, when researchers and journalists began analyzing missing persons data, was that her family's circumstances had weighted the scales from the start. Studies show that missing children from single-parent households, particularly those with working class or lower incomes, are significantly less likely to receive Amber Alerts or intensive law enforcement responses. They are more likely to be categorized as runaways, even when there is no evidence of intent to flee. The assumption, conscious or not, is that these families are less stable, and instability breeds kids who run. It's a bias baked into the system, and it's deadly. Because once the runaway label was applied to Lena's case, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Police didn't organize searches, so no ground was covered. They didn't canvass the neighborhood extensively, so no witnesses were found. They didn't treat her disappearance as an emergency, so no urgent leads were pursued. And when, after 24 hours, she still hadn't been found, the lack of evidence wasn't seen as a red flag, it was seen as confirmation. See? No signs of foul play. No evidence of abduction. She must have left on her own. At the 48-hour mark, a detective named Angela Ruiz was assigned to follow up. She called a few of Lena's friends, checked her social media accounts for any indication of plans to leave or contact with strangers, and found nothing suspicious. She noted in her report that Lena's online presence was consistent with a normal, well-adjusted teenager, but the case remained classified as a runaway. Carla printed flyers. She posted on every local Facebook group, every community board, every parent network she could find. She went door to door in her neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen anything. Neighbors helped. Friends helped. Strangers helped. The police waited. This was the first failure. Not a mistake, not an oversight, an institutional choice shaped by policy, bias, and a system that valued efficiency and optics over the lives of children who didn't fit a certain profile. Lena Brooks was categorized, filed, and set aside. And while the paperwork sat on a desk, she was running out of time. By the morning of October 13th, less than 24 hours after Lena disappeared, Carla had already printed 500 flyers. Her hands shook as she taped them to light poles, store windows, and community bulletin boards. Lena's school photo stared out from the page. Dark eyes, slight smile, the kind of face that could be anyone's daughter, anyone's sister. Beneath the photo in bold letters, missing, Lena Brooks, 14, last seen Tuesday 3:45 p.m. Carla's phone number was at the bottom, along with the police tip line, though she had already learned not to rely on the latter. Word spread fast in a town like Maple Falls. Parents shared the flyer in neighborhood Facebook groups. Teachers forwarded it to staff lists. By midday, hundreds of people had seen Lena's face. And many of them decided they couldn't just sit and wait. Volunteer search parties formed organically. Parents, coaches, teachers, people who had never met Lena but couldn't stomach the idea of a child missing in their town. They met in parking lots and divided into groups combing through the places teenagers might go. The park by the river, the walking trails behind the school, the old rail yard on the edge of town that kids sometimes used as a hangout spot. They searched drainage ditches and overgrown lots. They knocked on doors asking neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual. They called Lena's name until their voices went hoarse. Carla was everywhere. She barely slept. She walked the route from the school to her apartment over and over, studying every yard, every alley, every parked car, as if the answer might reveal itself if she just looked hard enough. Mason stayed with a neighbor because Carla couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop searching, couldn't let herself sit still long enough to feel the full weight of what was happening. The community showed up in force. But the police department did not. In the 72 hours following Lena's disappearance, the official law enforcement response consisted of the initial report filed by Officer Portman, a follow-up interview conducted by Detective Ruiz, 3 patrol units driving through the area where Lena was last seen, and a handful of phone calls to nearby jurisdictions, asking if anyone matching her description had turned up. There was no coordinated search, no canine units, no door-to-door canvassing by officers, no press conference appealing to the public for information. When Carla begged the department to do more, she was told they were monitoring the situation and that additional resources would be deployed if new information warranted it. She asked what that meant. What new information did they need? Her daughter was gone. The answer, delivered politely but firmly, was that they had no evidence of foul play. Until they did, this remained a runaway case, and departmental policy was clear. Carla went back to searching. What she didn't know, what would be revealed until the files were unsealed years later, was that on October 14th, just 2 days after Lena vanished, someone had called in a tip that might have changed everything. A woman named Patricia Coulter lived 2 streets over from Carla, on a quiet block called Hemlock Drive. On the night of October 13th, she had trouble sleeping. Around 2 a.m., she stepped outside for air and heard something that unsettled her. Faint sounds coming from the house next door. Thumping, maybe voices, though she couldn't be sure. It was hard to make out, but it was unusual. Her neighbor, Leonard Marsh, was a quiet man who kept to himself and rarely had visitors. By morning, Patricia had talked herself into calling it in. She told the dispatcher she wasn't sure it was anything, but with a girl missing in town, maybe someone should check. The call was logged at 9:17 a.m. A welfare check was dispatched to 428 Hemlock Drive. Officer Jason Benz arrived at 10:03 a.m. His body camera was activated, though the footage would later be listed as corrupted in the evidence logs. What survived was his written report, filed at the end of his shift. It was 4 sentences long. Responded to welfare check at 428 Hemlock Drive per dispatch. Knocked on front door. No answer. No signs of distress visible from exterior. Cleared scene at 10:05. 2 minutes. He spent 2 minutes at the house. He knocked, waited, saw that the door was locked and the curtains were drawn, and left. He didn't walk the perimeter. He didn't check the back door. He didn't speak to Patricia Coulter to ask what exactly she had heard. He marked the call as completed and moved on to the next item on his log. The report was reviewed and signed off by his supervisor, Sergeant Colin Haynes, who never questioned whether 2 minutes was sufficient for a welfare check in a town with an active missing persons case. Leonard Marsh was 62 years old, a retired contractor who had lived on Hemlock Drive for nearly 15 years. He had no criminal record. Neighbors described him as polite but private, someone who kept his lawn neat, said hello in passing, and otherwise kept to himself. He had never been married. He lived alone. There was nothing about him that stood out, nothing that raised alarm. His house was a modest single-story ranch with beige siding and a small front porch. It looked like every other house on the street. It was 11 minutes by car from Carla's apartment. 6 minutes from the police station. If you drew a map of the area and marked 3 points: Lena's home, the police department, and 428 Hemlock Drive, they formed a tight triangle, everything within a 2-mile radius. Lena had been walking home through the center of that triangle when she disappeared. Later, when investigators finally searched Marsh's property, they would find maps in his bedroom. Hand-drawn maps with routes marked in red ink. Lena's school, her apartment, the streets she walked, the times she passed certain corners. He had been watching her for months. And on October 12th, somewhere along those familiar streets, he had taken her. By October 14th, when Officer Vance knocked on his door and walked away, Lena had been in that house for over 48 hours. She was still alive. She was less than 2 miles from the police station, less than 15 minutes from her mother, trapped in a place that had been reported, checked, and cleared. No one came back. The search that could have saved her never happened. Not because it was impossible, but because no one with the authority to order it believed it was necessary. It would be 3 weeks before anyone stepped inside 428 Hemlock Drive with the authority to look beyond the front door. By then it was far too late. When investigators finally executed a search warrant on November 4th, 23 days after Lena Brooks disappeared, they found a house that looked, at first glance, exactly like what you would expect from a retired contractor living alone. The furniture was dated but well maintained. The kitchen was clean, dishes put away. Mail sat in a neat stack on the counter. A television in the living room was tuned to a local news station, volume low. Nothing about the main floor suggested anything unusual. It wasn't until they reached the primary bedroom that things began to shift. The bedroom itself was ordinary: a double bed, a dresser, a knit stand with a lamp and a glass of water. But at the far end of the room was a walk-in closet, deeper than it should have been for a house this size. Clothes hung on a rod to the left. Shelves lined the right side, stacked with boxes and old electronics. At the back of the closet, behind a row of winter coats, was a door. It was narrow, painted the same off-white as the walls, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. It had a deadbolt lock on the outside. When they opened it, they found a staircase. It was steep, the kind of rough construction you might see in an old farmhouse, leading to a cellar wooden steps. No railing, descending into darkness. The air that came up from below was stale and cold. The stairs led to what Leonard Marsh had described, in permit-skirting documents found later, as a sub-level storage area. In reality, it was an underground room, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, walls made of poured concrete, ceiling just under 7 feet high. There were no windows. The walls had been lined with soundproofing material, the kind used in recording studios, layers of foam panels fixed with industrial adhesive. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, controlled by a switch at the top of the stairs. There was a ventilation grate near the floor connected to a small, battery-operated fan that pulled air from a PVC pipe leading up to an exterior vent hidden behind a bush on the side of the house. It was not enough. Not for someone trapped down there for days. Against one wall was a thin mattress, stripped of sheets. Scattered around the room were empty plastic water bottles, 23 of them, counted and logged into evidence. In one corner, a plastic bucket with a lid. No toilet, no sink, no way out. And on the concrete walls etched into the surface with what investigators believed was a small stone or piece of metal were scratches, marks, tallies, words. One set of scratches near the mattress had been identified by forensic analysts as attempts to track time. Vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, 11 complete groups, 11 days. There were other marks too. Desperate clawed grooves near the base of the door where someone had tried to dig, to pry, to force their way out. The concrete had barely given, but the marks were deep enough to suggest hours of effort. In the center of one wall, scratched in uneven letters, were 2 words. Help My Leonard Marsh was a man no one had worried about. He was 62, retired from a small contracting business he had run for 30 years. He had lived in Maple Falls since 2008, in the house on Hemlock Drive that he had purchased outright with savings. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, someone who kept to himself but was never rude. He mowed his lawn. He waved when you drove by. He didn't cause trouble. I never would have guessed, Patricia Coulter would later say. He seemed so normal, but normal was a mask. When investigators searched the rest of the house, they found what Marsh had hidden in plain sight. In his bedroom, tucked into a drawer beneath neatly folded sweaters, was a journal. It was a standard composition notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, filled with handwritten entries dating back nearly 8 months. The entries were not diary-style reflections. They were surveillance logs. March 14th. Saw her walking to school. 7:42 a.m., blue jacket. Alone. April 3rd. Stops at corner store after soccer practice. Buys snacks for brother. Leaves at 4:15, May 22nd. Mother works nights. Confirmed. Lights go off in apartment by 10 p.m. Page after page, meticulous notes about Lena's routines. Where she went. What time she passed certain streets. When she was alone. There were photographs, printed from a digital camera, taken from a distance. Lena waiting at a crosswalk. Lena sitting on a bench outside school. Lena walking with her brother. There were maps. Hand-drawn diagrams of her route from school to home, with notes about which streets had the fewest people. Which corners had no surveillance cameras, which stretches were shaded by trees. On a page dated September 30th, less than 2 weeks before Lena disappeared, Marsh had written a single line. October. Tuesday or Wednesday, after 3:45, Birch Avenue. He had planned it. Watched her, waited for the right moment. And on October 12th, he had taken her. The timeline that emerged from forensic evidence, witness reports, and later analysis was as precise as it was devastating. Lena was abducted sometime between 3:50 and 4:05 p.m. on October 12th, most likely on Birch Avenue between the flower shop and the residential blocks. Marsh's Cara, nondescript beige sedan, was caught on a traffic camera 2 blocks away at 4:11 p.m., heading in the direction of Hemlock Drive. By 4:30 p.m., Lena was in the underground room. She remained there, alive for 11 days. During that time, patrol cars drove past Marsh's house at least 6 times as part of routine patrols. On October 14th, Officer Vance knocked on the door, spent 2 minutes on the porch, and left. On October 16th, a different officer drove slowly down Hemlock Drive as part of a canvassing effort organized by volunteers. He noted nothing unusual. Marsh continued his normal routines. He was seen at the grocery store on October 15th. A neighbor waved to him while he checked his mailbox on October 18th. He attended a community meeting about street repaving on October 20th and made small talk about the weather. No one suspected him. No one looked twice. This was not a case of a criminal mastermind evading a sophisticated investigation. This was a case of a system that refused to look. Marsh's house was reported. A welfare check was requested. An officer responded and then walked away after 2 minutes because the door was locked and no one answered. There was no follow-up, no second visit, no deeper inquiry. If Officer Vance had walked around the house, he might have heard something. If he had spoken to Patricia Coulter, he might have taken the call more seriously. If the case had been classified as an abduction instead of a runaway, a canvassing team might have knocked harder, asked more questions, insisted on searching homes in the area. But none of that happened. Lena Brooks spent 11 days in that room, alone in the dark, with no food and rationed water, scratching marks into concrete and hoping someone would find her. And less than 2 miles away, the police station carried on with business as usual. On November 4th, 3 weeks and 2 days after Lena Brooks disappeared, a water meter reader named Carl Nings was dispatched to 428 Hemlock Drive to investigate a reported leak that was affecting the neighbor's property line. When no one answered his knock, he walked around to the side of the house where the meter was located. That's when he noticed the smell. Police were called. A welfare check this time taken seriously led to forced entry. Inside, they found Leonard Marsh in the upstairs bathroom, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Time of death was estimated at 48 to 72 hours prior. And in the hidden room beneath the bedroom closet, they found Lena. She had been dead for more than a week. The official response was swift and carefully managed. Within hours, the police chief held a press conference. He stood behind a podium, flanked by somber-faced officials, and delivered the news that Maple Falls had lost one of its own. He called it a tragedy. He said the department had done everything in its power to find Lena, that they had followed every lead, exhausted every resource. He said that sometimes, despite the best efforts of law enforcement, evil finds a way. He did not mention the welfare check. He did not mention the 2-minute door knock. He did not mention that Lena had been less than 2 miles away reachable while officers drove past. The narrative was simple, polished, and final. A predator had taken a child, and by the time anyone could have known, it was already too late. A case closed by the suspect's death. A community grieving. Lessons about vigilance, about strangers, about the importance of safety. Carla Brooks, barely able to stand under the weight of her grief, knew immediately that she was being lied to. She knew because she had been there. She had watched the lack of urgency, the dismissals, the reassurances that Lena would come home on her own. She had begged them to search, and they had told her to wait. And now they were telling her there was nothing anyone could have done. She didn't believe them. 2 months after Lena's funeral, Carla filed her first Freedom of Information Act request, asking for all records related to her daughter's case. Reports, logs, communications, body camera footage, dispatch records, everything. The response came 6 weeks later. Request denied. Reason: ongoing investigative interests. But the case was closed. The suspect was dead. She tried again. Denied. She hired a lawyer. The request was partially granted, except that the documents she received were so heavily redacted, they were nearly useless. Entire pages were black bars. Names, dates, and critical details were erased. Carla refused to stop. Over the next 3 years, she was joined by local journalists who had covered Lena's case and smelled something wrong in the official story. They were joined by civil rights attorneys who had seen this pattern before, police departments closing ranks, bearing mistakes, prioritizing reputation over accountability. Together, they filed motion after motion. They appealed denials. They challenged redactions. They requested specific documents, dispatch logs, body cam footage, internal emails only to be told the footage was corrupted. The logs were incomplete, the emails were privileged. The department's legal argument was consistent. Releasing certain materials would compromise law enforcement methods, would violate privacy interests, would undermine public confidence in ongoing operations. Carla's attorney pointed out, again and again, that there were no ongoing operations. The case was closed. The only thing at stake was the truth. Finally, in year 4, a judge agreed. In a ruling that cited public interest and the family's right to know what had been done or not done to save their child, the court ordered the Maple Falls Police Department to release the unredacted files. What came out of that records room, once the doors were finally forced open, was damning. The shift logs were out of sequence, with gaps that made no sense, entire hours missing from the timeline of the days after Lena disappeared. The welfare check report filed by Officer Vance was there, all 4 sentences of it, signed off without question. His body camera footage, which departmental policy required be retained for a minimum of 5 years, was listed as file corrupted, unable to recover, but it was the internal emails that told the real story. On October 15th, 3 days after Lena vanished, a detective named Marcus Hill sent an email to his supervisor suggesting they expand the search radius and conduct door-to-door checks on all residences within a 2-mile area of where Lena was last seen. The reply from a lieutenant was brief, not justified at this time. Resources better spent elsewhere unless evidence of abduction surfaces. On October 18th, after volunteers found nothing and media coverage began to intensify, the police chief sent an email to senior staff with the subject line, "Messaging re. Brooks case." The email read, "In part, we need to be very careful about how we discuss our response timeline. If it gets out that we classified this as a runaway, we're going to face questions we can't answer in a way that makes us look good. Stick to the script. We did everything we could with the information we had." On November 5th, The day after Lena's body was found, a commander named Patricia Overton sent an email to the chief and 2 other senior officers. The subject line was exposure. The body of the email was chilling in its clarity. The welfare check is going to be a problem. If the family or the press gets hold of the fact that we were called to that address and cleared it in 2 minutes, public confidence in this department will be impossible to restore. We need to control what gets released and when. Suggest we classify as much as possible under investigative privilege. The chief's reply: agreed. Lock it down. There were no emails debating how to find Lena, no strategy sessions about investigative leads, no urgent communication about a missing child. Just damage control, optics management, self-preservation. The documents revealed a department that had not failed by accident, but by choice, and then had spent years ensuring no one would ever know. At every press conference, they had stood behind podiums and promised transparency, competence, and care. Behind closed doors, they had shredded timelines, buried evidence, and prioritized their own reputations over the life of a 14-year-old girl. And when she was found dead, they tried to bury the truth with her. Once the files became public, the carefully constructed narrative began to collapse, piece by piece. The first revelation to gain traction was the welfare check itself. Patricia Coulter's call to dispatch on October 14th had been logged time-stamped at 9:17 a.m. Marked as possible disturbance, request welfare check at 428 Hemlock Drive. The dispatcher had assigned it a standard priority level, not urgent but not dismissible either. But there was no record that anyone had flagged the address as being within the search radius for a missing child. No note that Hemlock Drive was less than 2 miles from where Lena Brooks was last seen. No indication that the welfare check had been cross-referenced with the active missing persons case. Officer Vance responded, spent 2 minutes on the porch, and cleared the call. His report was signed off without a single follow-up question. When journalists asked why the connection hadn't been made, the department's spokesperson said that without specific, credible evidence linking the 2 matters, it would have been improper to treat a routine welfare check as part of a separate investigation. Carla's attorney pointed out that the entire point of a welfare check during an active search was to look for connections. That was the job. Then came the body camera footage or the lack of it. Departmental policy documented in the personnel manual and cited in multiple training bulletins required all body-worn cameras to be activated during any call for service and for that footage to be retained for a minimum of 5 years, longer if related to an ongoing or sensitive case. Officer Vance's body camera had been activated when he arrived at 428 Hemlock Drive on October 14th. The metadata confirmed it. The device logged the start of recording at 10:03 a.m. But when the files were released, the footage itself was listed as corrupted, unable to recover. A digital forensics expert hired by Carla's legal team reviewed the metadata and the department's storage protocols. His conclusion, submitted in a court filing, was blunt. The file had not corrupted naturally. It had been deleted, and the deletion had occurred weeks after the case was closed, during the same period when FOIA requests were being filed. The department denied any intentional destruction of evidence, but could not explain how a single file, from a single call on a single day related to the most high-profile case in the town's history, had been the only one to suffer catastrophic data loss. The next crack came from within. In early 2024, a former dispatcher named Lauren Michaels came forward. She had left the Maple Falls Police Department in 2022, citing burnout and dissatisfaction with departmental culture. Once the files became public and the internal emails were exposed, she decided she couldn't stay silent. In a televised interview with a regional news station, Michaels described what had happened behind the scenes in the days after Lena disappeared. "We all knew it was a runaway classification," she said. "And we were told not in writing but in person by supervisors to let it cool off. Those were the words they used. Let the runaway case cool off. The family will move on." She described an environment where missing children from certain kinds of families were treated as lower priority, where the assumption was always that the kid would come back and where questioning those assumptions could get you labeled as difficult or overly emotional. "I remember one of the senior dispatchers saying, 'We don't have the resources to chase every teenager who doesn't want to come home,'" Michael said. But Lena wasn't a teenager who didn't want to come home. She was a child who was taken. And we didn't care enough to find out the difference. Her testimony gave a voice to what the emails had already suggested. This was not a series of innocent mistakes. It was a pattern, a culture, a system designed to avoid the messy, resource-intensive work of actually protecting vulnerable kids. The local media, which had spent years repeating the department's official statements without much scrutiny, began to ask harder questions. Reporters revisited the press conferences from 2020 and compared what the chief had said then. "We are doing everything possible, no stone unturned. Our full resources are deployed," with what the files now showed. They interviewed other families who had reported missing teens and been told the same things Carla had been told. They found patterns: kids from single-parent homes, kids whose families didn't have money or connections, kids who were written off as runaways and never searched for with urgency. One newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "While Lena Brooks died, police managed optics." The department had been confident the records would stay buried. They had fought for years, spent taxpayer money on legal fees, and built walls of redaction and procedural delay because they believed time and bureaucracy would outlast a grieving mother. They were wrong. Every denial was appealed. Every redaction was challenged. Every discrepancy was exposed. And with each new revelation, the department's credibility crumbled. By the time the final batch of documents was released, the police chief had resigned. 3 senior officers took early retirement. Officer Vance was placed on administrative leave and later quietly let go. The entire command structure that had been in place during Lena's case was gone. The cover-up had failed. Not because the system self-corrected. Not because internal accountability mechanisms worked. But because Carla Brooks refused to let them bury her daughter twice. Grief is hard enough when you lose someone you love. But grief compounded by betrayal by the knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect your child chose not to, and then spent years hiding that choice, is a different kind of pain entirely. Carla Brooks stopped working as a nurse. She couldn't go back. Every shift reminded her of the night she came home to find Lena gone, the hours she had been sleeping while her daughter was being taken. The hospital offered her leave, then disability, then eventually accepted her resignation. She sold the apartment above the hardware store. She couldn't walk past Lena's empty bedroom anymore, couldn't sit on the couch where they used to watch crime shows together. Mason, who had been 8 years old when his sister disappeared, grew up in the shadow of her absence. He struggled in school, withdrew from friends, carried a guilt no child should have to carry, the irrational but persistent belief that if he had been older, smarter, stronger, he could have done something. Carla tried to hold them both together, but some days it felt like they were just going through the motions of living, waiting for a resolution that would never come. And then she learned the truth. When the unsealed files revealed that Lena had been alive, reachable, while officers walked away from the house where she was held, Carla's grief turned into something else: rage, clarity, purpose. In 2023, she filed a civil lawsuit against the Maple Falls Police Department, the town, and 5 individual officers, including Officer Vance and the supervisors who had signed off on his 2-minute welfare check. The lawsuit alleged negligence, wrongful death, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It laid out in meticulous detail every failure: the runaway classification, the ignored welfare check, the lack of follow-up, the suppression of evidence, the years of stonewalling records requests. The town's attorneys fought it for 9 months, filing motions to dismiss, arguing sovereign immunity, claiming the officers had acted within the scope of their discretion. But the evidence was overwhelming. The emails alone were enough to show deliberate indifference. In late 2023, the town offered a settlement, $3.2 million, to be paid out over 5 years. There was one condition: Carla had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She could take the money, but she could never speak publicly about the case again. No interviews, no advocacy, no testimony. The attorneys told her it was standard. They told her it was a significant amount of money, enough to secure Mason's future, to give them both stability. Carla refused. "I didn't fight for 4 years to get a check and shut up," she said in a statement released through her lawyer. "I fought so that people would know what happened to my daughter, so that it wouldn't happen to someone else's." She rejected the settlement and took the case to trial. The town, facing the prospect of a public courtroom airing of every email, every failure, every cover-up attempt, came back to the table. This time they dropped the gag order. The final settlement was smaller, $1.8 million, but it came with something more valuable: accountability. The police chief resigned. 3 senior officers took early retirement. Officer Vance was terminated. The department issued a public apology, acknowledging serious failures in policy, training, and response that had contributed to a preventable tragedy. But Carla wasn't satisfied with apologies. She wanted change. Working with child advocacy organizations, civil rights attorneys, and state legislators, Carla pushed for a package of reforms that would be named in Lena's memory. The Lena Brooks Child Safety Act, introduced in the state legislature in early 2024, included several key provisions. Mandatory Amber Alerts. All missing children under 18 would trigger an automatic alert system, regardless of whether they were classified as runaways, unless evidence definitively proved they left voluntarily and were not in danger. Independent review of welfare checks. Any welfare check called in during an active missing persons investigation within a 10-mile radius would be flagged for supervisory review and required documentation of the search conducted. Body cam retention requirements. All footage related to missing persons cases or welfare checks would be preserved for a minimum of 7 years, with automatic backup to state servers to prevent deletion or corruption. Bias training. Mandatory training for all officers on implicit bias in missing persons cases, specifically addressing the disproportionate classification of children from marginalized communities as runaways. When Carla testified before the state legislature in support of the bill, she brought a photograph of Lena, the same one from the missing person flyers. She set it on the table in front of her and spoke for 12 minutes without notes. She described the day Lena disappeared, the calls she made that were dismissed, the searches the police didn't conduct, the welfare check that lasted 2 minutes, the emails about managing optics while her daughter died alone. And then she said this: the department wants to call this a tragedy. They want to talk about lessons learned and moving forward. But this was not a tragedy. Tragedies are accidents. This was a choice. It was a choice to check a box that said runaway instead of doing the work. It was a choice to spend 2 minutes at a door instead of 2 hours. It was a choice to protect their reputation instead of my daughter's life. And then it was a choice to bury the evidence so no one would know. She paused, looking directly at the legislators in front of her. You can't give me my daughter back. You can't undo what was done. But you can make sure the next mother who calls 911 crying because her child is missing doesn't get told to wait and see if they come home. You can make sure the next welfare check isn't cleared in 2 minutes because it's easier than knocking twice. You can make Lena's life mean something. The bill passed unanimously in both chambers. It was signed into law in June 2024. Justice, in Lena's case, will always be incomplete. There is no sentence that brings her back, no policy that undoes her death, no amount of accountability that makes Carla whole. But accountability, however late, still matters. It matters because it lifts the difference between a system that hides its failures and one that faces them. It matters because the next child who goes missing might be found because of the changes Lena's death forced into being. And it matters because Carla Brooks refused to let her daughter be forgotten twice. Lena Brooks' case is not an outlier. It is a pattern. Across the United States, thousands of children are reported missing every year, and a disproportionate number of them, particularly those from single-parent homes, low-income families, or communities of color, are immediately classified as runaways. That label, applied with a checkbox and often without investigation, becomes a death sentence for urgency. Because once a child is labeled a runaway, the system stops looking. Resources are redirected, searches are delayed, and families are told to wait. The assumption is always the same: troubled kids from unstable homes make bad choices. They'll come back when they're ready. But the data tells a different story. Studies show that many children classified as runaways are actually fleeing abuse or are victims of trafficking.